Anyway, all of you have braved some difficult weather conditions and roads to be here together. I'm just so grateful to see everybody. As you know, we've got a special service today, and we'll say more about that. But let's go ahead and get started. Come into the circle of love and justice. Come into this community of mercy, holiness, and health. Come, and you shall know peace and joy. For our chalice lighting, I've got words from Christine Robinson. We gather this hour as people of faith, with joys and sorrows, gifts and needs. We light this beacon of hope, sign of our quest for truth and meaning in celebration of the life we share together. During COVID, that's one of the legacies of COVID that's a good one, is we now have this library of music from congregations that did that kind of work, that put everything online for 2 years or a year or two. And so if you go to YouTube and just search Unitarian Universalist music or Unitarian Universalist hymns, which I do quite often, and just sort through and just play some of our beautiful music, and you can see some wonderful congregations and their settings and some beautiful choirs. And so thanks to the folks at Baltimore for putting that one together. Now's the time for us to sing, and I've chosen Guide My Feet, 348 for opening hymn, because today's message generally is a social justice message. It's kind of timed for Martin Luther King's weekend, which is the next weekend. But I thought that notion of guiding my feet would be also appropriate for our new parents and our family and the child that we're welcoming into the congregation. It kind of fits into that theme. So stand as you're able or choose to, and let's join together for hymn number 348, Guide My Feet. And Pat as well for your music. It always nice lively song to get us started. Well, today we're going to engage in a ceremony that is ancient and timeless. In all places and in all times, parents have presented newly born children to their communities in rites of passage that evoke both solemn worship and great celebration. Kristen and Matt, please come forward with your child. And I'm going to switch. If our tech folks, can we turn this camera or just turn this around, whichever one? It's already there. It's already there. Are we good? Yeah. Are we all in there? All right. Now there's a little story for that. We give a single rose with it's been dethorned to parents with our new children, and then when our young people, you've done this, but it's been a while. But when your young people turn 18, we have a ceremony in which they give them a rose that is not dethorned. It has the thorns, and it kind of indicates that they're now going beyond the protection that we've offered them as a younger child. So hopefully we'll all be around in another 18 years when we give Avery a thorned rose. And what a symbol that will be. What a wonderful, that's my absolute favorite ceremony, is child dedication ceremonies, more than all of our other rites of passage. They all come with different opportunities. But I love that. So we're so glad to have, and Avery did just great. I tell you. You know, I've done enough of these to say that, you know, there's a spectrum of how the kids do during these services. There's a reason why we make them short and make them early in the service. But Avery's doing just fine. So we welcome Avery. Well, that's certainly a joy with which we can start our joys and concerns. And just by way of opening up our time for joys and concerns, I do want to start with a concern and just sort of raise for our awareness what we're already seeing on the news all the time, and that's all the folks in California dealing with the fires and being displaced, and the tragedies that we're seeing there. And then the joy, though, of seeing in any kind of natural disaster, seeing people come together and seeing neighbors helping each other and seeing everybody rally around different communities. So it's both a joy and a concern when we look to the world's affairs and the news that's happening in the world today. With that, So the inauguration, though, adds a certain urgency to my remarks and kind of changes the perspective just a little bit. And it's not like we didn't have a lot of work to do anyway, but without getting partisan, I think it's fair to say that we will have a lot more work to do in the very near future. So, although I've always thought of myself as a social justice advocate, I learned an important lesson about advancing social justice early in my ministerial career when I was just a student minister of a small family congregation in New Madison, Ohio. It's when I was in seminary. It's about this size. The UUA has a process by which congregations may be designated a welcoming congregation if they undertake certain activities to identify and remove any barriers in themselves personally, in the congregation's bylaws and policies, to the full barriers to the full inclusion of the LGBTQ plus community. By the way, you have not gone through that process, or at least you don't have the little symbol in the UUA's thing that says, oh, well, we'll have to get on the UUA because you're not listed as that. So congratulations. So you know what it is. So I wanted that small family congregation to go through that process. I thought it'd be really neat to have that little symbol on the website for that congregation. As it happened, there were two gay individuals in the congregation. So I approached them about leading this effort. Each of them said no. One of them admonished me that just because he happened to be gay, he did not want to be reduced to leading every gay parade. Fair enough. The other one said that his primary interest in social justice happened to be climate change, not gay rights. And in terms of his time and energy and resources, that's what he wanted to focus on. That's perfectly fine. So from that exchange, though, I learned a lot about what it means to be a servant leader, which is to help a congregation go in the direction that the congregation wants to go. As UUs, we may have a broad consensus on many social policy issues, but time, money, resources, even building space have limits that have to be prioritized. And it's just as important in the servant leadership model to develop a consensus on the priorities as the positions themselves. I also learned that it is a form of oppression to expect members of a group to be the spokespersons for that group. Finally, I learned a lot about being an ally. When people are marginalized or oppressed, it's not up to me to tell them what they need to do. Rather, it's up to me to listen to them, to recognize their agency over their lives, and to support them in the choices they make for themselves, which is easier said than done. And that's what I'm going to spend more time exploring today. As you know, I've got a pretty diverse career and I draw on some different things. Sometimes I draw on my seminary training and ministry, and sometimes I draw on the law, and sometimes I draw on history, or mix and match. Today it's history. Next month it's going to be seminary, but today it's history. The social challenges, social justice challenges today are different than those of the 19th century, as is our response. But the history of these earlier social justice movements offers lessons in what we may do today, as well as a few cautionary notes to guide our work today. Sometimes you have to step out of what you're in and look at something different to be able to see kind of what you need to do today. And that's kind of what I'm doing with this. So during the early decades of the Jim Crow era, African Americans did not speak with one voice. Booker T. Washington was more of a gradualist. He did not fight Jim Crow, but rather focused on ensuring that African Americans had economic opportunity through vocational education, most notably through the founding of the Tuskegee Institute. It's about 40 miles west of Montgomery, Alabama. On the other hand, W.E.B. DuBois focused on political equality, particularly the right to vote that had been promised in the 15th Amendment, which, spoiler alert, arguably wasn't realized until the 1965 Voting Rights Act, which, another spoiler alert, was gutted for all practical purposes by the U.S. Supreme Court's decision in Shelby v. Holder in 2013. So when it comes to voting rights, we don't need to just advance, we need to catch up to where we were. These approaches are not mutually exclusive, but they were rival approaches that divided the African American community. Washington set out its platform most famously in an 1895 address at an Atlanta exposition, saying, "In all things that are purely social, we can be as separate as the fingers, yet one as the hand in all things essential to mutual progress." That is a way of saying he could live with Jim Crow. We could live separately. We can be segregated, but there are some mutual things that we need to come together on. What he considered mutual progress was economic opportunity and prosperity. He was not trying to get white supremacists to accept African Americans. He just wanted his community to have access to good paying jobs so that it could afford a decent home, a modest standard of living. In his address, he said, "The opportunity to earn $1 in a factory just now is worth infinitely more than the opportunity to spend $1 in an opera house." So now, last phrase was a little dig at DuBois, right? Who was advocating integration and things like entertainment and transportation. You might recall, by the way, just again, perspective, Plessy versus Ferguson, upholding so-called separate but equal, was 1896. All of this is really between like 1890 and 1910, this reference that I'm talking about today. As you might guess, Washington was much more popular among whites than Du Bois. Arguably, in the same way, the Reverend Martin Luther King Jr.'s nonviolent resistance was more popular among whites than more militant approaches to Malcolm X and Black Panthers and so forth. As I noted, Du Bois was much more interested in equality and civil rights, including voting, education, transportation, and commerce. He was co-founder of the NAACP on this very date in 1909. So, happy 116th birthday to the NAACP. It also is, by the way, you probably already knew this, the birthday of Charles Darwin and Abraham Lincoln on the same day in 1809, same year. So there you go. Good company. Du Bois had published The Souls of Black Folk in 1903, and that should be required reading for anyone engaged in civil rights work. That's one of the standards. In 1905, he and William Trotter founded the Niagara Movement specifically to counter Washington's efforts. Du Bois said of Washington, he, quote, represents in Negro thought the old attitude of adjustment and submission. His doctrine has tended to make the whites, North and South, shift the burden of the Negro problem to the Negro's shoulders. That's Du Bois talking about Washington. Right? Washington had less to say about Du Bois. He said Du Bois is a great leader and he has done much for his race. And I'm not sure how he said that, but it reads patronizing when you read it. Well, yeah, he's a good guy. But you can see these differences in approaches, right? You can see that. Now, final note about the two men that should inform our advocacy today. Washington was born in 1856 in Halesford, Virginia. So he would have been a very young child during the Civil War. It would have been fought in a lot of it in Virginia. He would have been around that. And living as he did in the South, he would have been a first-hand witness to the terrorism of the KKK. Du Bois was born in 1868 in Great Barrington, Massachusetts. So after the Civil War and in a free state. So it's fair to state that they had very different lived experiences. The person born into the slave community, lived through the Civil War, lived with the KKK and terrorism, was more of the gradualist who wanted to just make sure people had a job and could afford their homes and take care of their families. And it's the one who was born up north who did not have any of those experiences that wanted to wage the greatest fight for political equality and integration and so forth. And that really says a lot. There's a lot to that. I'm going to come back to that point. So during this same era, women were as divided as African Americans on how best to secure their rights and liberties. In 1869, women, mostly women, joined by some progressive men, formed two competing organizations to advance justice for women. The American Woman Suffrage Association was founded by two prominent Unitarians, Lucy Stone and Julia Ward Howe. The same one, Battle Hymn of the Republic, Julia Ward Howe. Very prominent, and that organization populated by lots of very prominent Unitarians. Now, the National Woman Suffrage Association was founded by the more famous duo Susan B. Anthony and Elizabeth Cady Stanton. Anthony was a Quaker, by the way. Stanton was a Presbyterian. Now, there were two main differences between the groups. The American Association supported, the 15th Amendment, which barred voting discrimination based on race. So in effect, it was only black men. All right. But which, as we know, it did not extend the vote to women. The National Association, the one with Susan B. Anthony and Elizabeth Cady Stanton, opposed the 15th Amendment precisely because it did not include women, creating divisions then between African Americans and women in how to advance their own respective causes. In fact, one of the arguments of the aforementioned W.E.B. DuBois for the 15th Amendment was that black men would vote to keep the vote away from women. That was his appeal. So he was playing that card. He was trying to join forces with the anti-suffrage movement as leverage to get blacks the right to vote. You know, when you study history, like in high school, when I'm teaching it, I really don't teach all of these divisions. You know, we come out of and maybe even come out of college thinking these great champions for all these causes, and it's not quite the way it works. It's not quite the way it works. There was another difference besides the 15th Amendment that divided them. The two suffrage groups disagreed on strategy. The American Association, the one with Lucy Stone, favoring action at the state level, the National Association putting all of their efforts into an amendment to the U.S. Constitution. Now, like the differences among African Americans, these differences were not mutually exclusive, but they still divided the movement. Think about office space, resources, who you're going to write your donation to. You've got two separate organizations, the American Suffrage and the National Suffrage, saying this, give money to us and so forth. Come to our meetings. Okay, in fact, there we go. 15 states, mostly in the West, had granted full suffrage to women before the 19th Amendment made it the law of the land in the United States. 15 states. And arguably, the experience of women's suffrage in those states added to the momentum that led to the 19th Amendment to the Constitution. So you can see how the two strategies, like I said, they're not mutually exclusive. They just had separate office spaces and bank accounts and everything else, and these other disagreements that were going on. Now, let's not forget that this was the same era of the temperance movement that gave us prohibition. In fact, those advocates got their amendment added to the Constitution before the suffragists, right? 18th Amendment, prohibition, 1919. 19th Amendment, right to vote for women in 1920. So right in that same era. That's a fascinating era to study, I must say, if you're into social justice, that whole progressive era. Women were divided whether to put their time and energy into one movement or the other. Remember what I said earlier about prioritizing time, money, resources, and energy. The suffrage movement, which was itself divided, but let's think of that as a whole. The suffrage movement meant to advance civil rights. The temperance movement meant to improve the daily lives of women, because the real impetus for temperance was not religious piety. It was the tremendous toll alcohol was taking on women in the form of abuse by men and unemployment and health and well-being. Remember, this was, in these days, they did not have water systems. I mean, alcohol was what you drank all day. Grog or whatever, ale. I mean, it's just different. So remember, you didn't necessarily have running water in a lot of places. So it's a different context. It's not an exact parallel to that whole Washington and DuBois debate, but you can see one is focused on political and voting and the legislation. One's focused on quality of life and ways of living, day-to-day life. You see that in both movements, okay? Although she was not active in the temperance movement, the Unitarian astronomer, Maria Mitchell, I always like to talk about where our ancestors in faith were on these. I've got a whole sermon on Maria Mitchell for you for another occasion. First professional female astronomer, all right, she was an active suffragist, but she also wrote, the needle is the chain of the needle is the chain of woman and has fettered her more than the laws of the country. That is, the social burden on women is greater than the political burden on women. The needle is the chain of woman and has fettered her more than the laws of the country. Maria Mitchell. One final point on historical social justice movements. We should not underestimate the power of the written word. Earlier, I mentioned the importance of DuBois' book, The Souls of Black Folk. There are a great many examples of works by others whose contributions were primarily through their writings. In fact, one of my lamentations is that I retired before I could teach a class called History Through Literature, because I think I could have taught the history of the United States through literature rather than like legislation and Supreme Court decisions. We may not have had independence without Thomas Paine's common sense. Harriet Beecher Stowe's Uncle Tom's Cabin was so influenced public opinion against slavery that when he met her, Lincoln is reported to have said, "So you're the little lady who wrote the book that started this great war." Add to that Upton Sinclair's The Jungle, Rachel Carson's Silent Spring. In short, literature has played a great role in advancing social justice. And think about that when you're thinking of what is your calling and what is your talent? Where does it lie? Literature is pretty important if you can write and like to write. So how does this inform our social justice actions today? Oppressed and marginalized groups are not monolithic. And it would be wrong to assume that because someone is Black or white or who identifies as cisgendered or LGBTQ+, or is an undocumented immigrant from Mexico versus an undocumented immigrant from Venezuela, and so forth, that person or members or leaders of the advocacy groups within their communities all think alike. I think we're probably on the same page there. Some of us may identify with some of those groups here in this room. And it doesn't mean that you have to agree on what actions to take, even with each other here in this room. Okay. For those of us who may not identify as members of an oppressed or marginalized groups, we are allies. And there is a difference. There is a difference. We must recognize the agency of those people to determine for themselves how to seek justice. So I'm what would be a principal in some things that really apply to me. I talked to you in November about things like the Farm Bill and the dietary guidelines and personal health and how that's a thing for me. But as somebody who is a white, cisgendered male, college educated, I'm pretty safe come January 20th. Personally. And I should have added born in the United States. I'm pretty safe. Now, that doesn't mean that some people I love aren't on the line, but I'm an ally to everybody else in most regards. Although, as you would all know, I have my issues. Right? Long before Kimberly Crenshaw coined the term intersectionality in 1989, the lives of Washington and DuBois show us how biography shapes our values. That applies as much to those advocating for their own justice as well as their allies. When we're sitting across the table with like-minded advocates for a cause, it's important not only to share with each other our commitment to the cause, but our stories as well. Building relationships builds bridges. Building relationships builds bridges. Finally, congregations must make choices. They can do more than one thing at once, but they cannot do 10 things at once. If we were to rank our priorities from 1 to 10, we might all include immigration, climate change, civil rights, LGBTQ inclusion, reproductive freedom, opposition to the death penalty, common sense gun regulations, but we would not put them in the same order. And we might disagree on how to advance those issues, even if we did. Moreover, because in many of these areas we are more likely to be allies than those who may be directly affected, it's not necessarily our preferences and our priorities that make the difference. What matters is what's happening in this community. Where are the pain points in Cumberland, Maryland, and its environs? Because you've got people in 3 different states here. So that changes things a little bit for you, doesn't it? How can this congregation serve those who are advocating for themselves? None of this precludes writing to your elected leaders, showing up at hearings or matters that you may prioritize. You may be able to do 10 things at once. That's fine. Just by way of an update from my November sermon, the Farm Bill, the 5-year Farm Bill, they passed at the lame duck session, extended it for 1 year. So they still have the 5-year Farm Bill. And this is the year that the dietary guidelines are up for their regular review of every 5 years. Those are things I care about. I'm going to follow those. And I belong to organizations that send me updates and newsletters and things like that. We all can have our individual priorities. But as a congregation, you have to make some choices. And I hope today's message may offer you some thoughts on how to do so. For those who are interested, we're going to continue this conversation after the service. We'll do what we've started doing here this year. We'll gather after some social time and some snacks. We'll gather in the back for some continued conversation about, well, what does this congregation want to prioritize? And what are the pain points here? Where are the members of this congregation going to be advocating for themselves, their own issues, and where will they be acting, or you be acting, or we be acting as allies? And what does that mean? Right. And so that's the conversation I want us to continue, and we'll do that starting today. But in the meantime, I'm going to go ahead and close with these words from the Unitarian minister Edward Everett Hale. These are in the order at the back of your reading, so you may have heard this before. Famous Unitarian who was writing at the turn of the 19th century, same era, same progressive era. I am only one, but I am one. I cannot do everything, but I can do something. and I will not let what I cannot do interfere with what I can do. May it always be so, and blessed be. Another one that always haunts me, and I don't know what to do. This is where it goes back to we just have to defer to others. But it's really hard. I recognize why it's very difficult for me to tell anybody else who's in an oppressed and marginalized community, wait your turn. Now, objectively setting back and looking at how history moves, there's some truth to that. In terms of where the energy of the people are and the news and the events that drive things, right? We saw, the movement for same-sex marriage seemed to go really fast by historical terms, right? But I go back to 1998 and the murder, I think it's 98, the murder of Matthew Shepard as a turning point in the same way Emmett Till's murder was a turning point. Remember the Montgomery bus boycott was started in December of the same year after the summer murder of Emmett Till. And this is why history matters. This is why everybody should have a history teacher for a minister. Right? But, and sometimes you don't control those events. In fact, you never control those events. And sometimes then your social justice takes on different energy and direction, right? We've got a lot of groups that 8 days from now, and some of you may be in those groups. As I said, I'm not. But if we start the editorial we of the United States and the new administration, the new Congress, and starts doing the mass incarceration of immigrants, that's like in front of us. It's immediate. They're here. They're tearing up families and so forth. But then at the same time, what about the trans community? And all the protections are going to be withdrawn from the trans community. What's going to get the front page, even though we don't use newspapers anymore, but the front page has only so much room for stories. And in the 23 minutes allotted to a national newscast, when you take out the commercials, what gets on there and what draws the attention? And so these are hard things. Justice is a hard. That's why we've been writing about it for more than 2,000 years. That's why why we've got the book of Amos. That'll really get me started. Start talking about the prophets, and then if I start pounding the podium, we're going to be here another hour. So we're not going to do that. We're not going to do that. But things are going to change significantly in ways that I had been in denial about until a couple of months ago, and in just 8 days. And it may change our priorities and what's happening in our country. And so we need to think about that. Well, that's a good note to say we will continue this very conversation after people have had a chance to refresh a little bit and grab something to eat and visit with each other. And those that have to move along, I certainly understand that, but I hope you can stay and we can have a good conversation about what we might do about that. In the meantime, we're going to close with a song from the Teal hymnal, if you have that. But the words, am I correct? The words are going to be up there. When our heart is in a holy place. And perhaps that is the short answer to what do we do with all these problems, is if your heart is in a holy place, then that you can go, right? Whatever it is, right? And so let's start there and affirm that with this beautiful music, When Our Heart is in a Holy Place. Please stand as you're able and then remain standing for our closing words. Special thanks to Kristen and Matt. Are they still? Yeah. And Avery and the family. Happy birthday to all that. Good stuff. Thanks for a wonderful service today. Be ours a religion like sunshine that goes everywhere. It's temple, all space. It's creed, all truth. It's ritual, works of love, and it's profession of faith, divine living. Go in peace, everyone.